In the last episode, we talked about the powers that Congress holds. In this episode, we're going to talk about the most important power that Congress holds, and that's the ability to pass legislation, to pass laws. So in this episode, we're going to look at how a bill becomes a law. First off, what is a bill? A bill is just a written idea for a law. A bill can be started in either House of the Congress, so it can be started in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. Now there's an exception to this rule, and that exception is to do with revenue bills. If we're going to raise taxes, those bills have to start in the House of Representatives. Since both houses have to pass a bill worded exactly the same, it doesn't happen very often. Only about 3% of all bills become laws. It's a very long, tedious, drawn-out, and involved process. Step 1. Where is this bill going to start? The step is first is the bill is introduced. It gets a number. Now, depending on where it's starting, it gets a different prefix to this number. If it's starting in the House of Representatives, it gets an HR, and then the number follows. If it's starting in the Senate, it gets an S, and then the number follows. Once it's been numbered, it gets read. Only members of Congress may submit a bill. So let's talk about where they get their ideas for these bills, though. Any citizen can suggest a bill to a member of Congress. Even you, as somebody young enough that you're not allowed to vote, you can still write your congressman and suggest a law. For the most part, ideas come from people called lobbyists. Lobbyists are people who are paid to influence politicians and suggest certain ideas in an attempt to shape policy. All kinds of different special interest groups employ lobbyists. For example, teachers employ lobbyists. The teachers union employs lobbyists to go both to Tallahassee here in Florida and to Washington, D.C. to try to convince members of both legislatures to spend more money on education. Another example of an important lobby would be the NRA, the National Rifle Association. They spend huge amounts of money on lobbyists, making sure that conservative representatives don't introduce or don't agree with legislation that is going to limit the Second Amendment rights of Americans. Okay, so step 2, the bill goes to committee. The reason why we use a committee system is because there's a lot of work to do in Congress, and it has to be divided up. Remember, between the House and the Senate, we have well over 500 members. So committees are how they group themselves and actually get something accomplished. Now, there's 3 types of committees. A standing committee is a permanent committee that focuses on a specific area. A select committee is temporary. It meets to deal with a specific special issue. Once the issue has been covered, it dissolves and is no longer needed. And then finally, there's joint committees. Joint committees bring members of both the House and the Senate together to work on an issue. Now, there's all kinds of standing committees. These are probably the most important and the most common. Standing committees are similar to the Appropriations Committee. This is where they discuss where money is going to be spent. The Budget Committee is how the money is going to be spent. Armed Services, this is talking about the military and defense. The Labor Committee talks about working conditions. Foreign Affairs talks about our relationships with other countries. The Judiciary Committee talks about courts and impeachment. So these are just some examples of standing committees. There's dozens and dozens of them. Both the House and the Senate has a version of their own. Now, the leaders of these committees are by far the most important and the most powerful members of Congress. There's 2 key qualifications to be a leader of a congressional committee. You have to be a member of the majority party. So when we say majority, we're talking about who has the most members in Congress. So is it the Republicans who are in charge, or is it the Democrats? Whoever's in charge, these committee leaders are going to belong to that political party. The second qualification for this is seniority. By seniority, we mean how long have you been in Congress? the longer you have been there, the more seniority you have and the more power you have. Okay, so the bill has gone to committee. After that, step 3, we're actually going to go to an even smaller committee. So we've gone from the full House or the full Senate to a committee, but inside that committee, because the committee could be a dozen or so people, we're going to break down even more, and just a couple of people, 3, 4, are going to be looking at a specific bill. This is called a subcommittee. Now, what happens in these subcommittees? This is where the meat and potatoes are. This is where the real work is done. The actual law and any ramifications it might have on society are going to be investigated here at the subcommittee. This is where the most critical stage. This is where the bill lives or dies. And a bill can spend a huge amount of time in a subcommittee, sometimes from 6 months to a full year, because they're doing all the research on it. They're digging up all the information that would be needed to decide if this is a good idea or a bad idea. So step 4, it goes, once the subcommittee has made up its mind, is this a good idea or a bad idea, then the whole committee votes. The subcommittee kind of makes a presentation to the rest of the committee, and they're like, this is what we think, this is what we found, and after that, the whole committee is going to vote. If the committee votes no, we're out of luck. And the piece of legislation, the bill, the idea goes back to the writer, and it's pretty much dead. The writer can kind of reform it and start the whole process over again, but for the most part, we're at a dead end. If the committee votes yes, then we're going to move on, and it's going to be put on the calendar for House for debate. So step 5, we're going to have a full House or a full Senate vote. So, but in order to have a vote, we have to have a quorum. A quorum is a majority. We have to have over 50% of either the House, if we're starting this bill in the House, or 50% in the Senate available. So let's pretend that our piece of legislation is in the House. They can debate and vote on amendments. If people, let's say this piece of legislation is on education, but there's a congressman from Alabama who needs money for bridges. He can add an amendment to this legislation and sneak that in. Now, it takes a while to get all these things added and get a final version of the bill to vote on. So once they get that final version, if the House floor votes no, it goes back to committee. The committee can try to rewrite it, resubmit it, or it could end up just dying there. If they vote yes, and they need a mere majority to do this. Once they voted yes, now it goes to the Senate for consideration, because both houses, both the House and the Senate, need to approve it. And they need to approve the exact same language. Do you see why only 3% pass? So the Senate has to pass it too before it comes along. If they vote no, they're done. If they vote yes, we move along. But before we do any voting, we're going to do some debating. And the rules, depending on what house you're in, are different. So first we're going to talk about debate in the House of Representatives. This is dictated by the Speaker of the House and the Rules Committee. How long each person gets, what they're allowed to do, blah, blah, blah. It's all very strictly regulated. And if you're on the bad side of the Speaker of the House, too bad, so sad, you don't get to speak. So the procedures in debate and amendments is much, much more strict and limited in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, it's completely the opposite. The Senate was once called the most deliberative body in the world. So they like to bicker and argue and carry on. What this means is that there's no limits that are allowed. So before the vote is considered, everybody is allowed to hash out as long as they want to. It could take weeks and weeks and weeks for them to all feel that they've had their say before it goes to a vote. Now, this is the kicker. Because of this rule, we can play dirty politics, and that's called a filibuster. Let's say, because the debate is unlimited, if a senator doesn't like the bill, they can just talk on and on and on and on about anything. It doesn't even have to be about the bill. They can talk on and on and on for hours holding up the voting. An example of this, Ted Cruz filibustered a bill in the Senate, and he read Dr. Seuss to his children. They were watching it at home on C-SPAN, and he was reading Dr. Seuss to them. Had absolutely nothing to do with the legislation, but that was his method of filibustering it. What happens with a filibuster is eventually other senators just give in. They give up and they leave, and there's no quorum anymore. Once you're below 50% of the people there, then you can't vote, and the bill kind of just dies. The poor bill. Dead, dead, dead. Now, what happens if the bill actually miraculously passes both houses? Then the next step is it goes to the president's desk. If by some chance the president actually likes it and signs it, yay, it becomes a law. What if he doesn't, though? So the president can take 4 different options. The president can sign it, it becomes a law. The president can veto it. If the bill is vetoed, it gets passed back to Congress. If they can get a 2/3 majority vote, they can override his veto. Very, very, very rarely does this ever happen. It's rare enough to even get a bill to the president, say anything about override his veto. If the president doesn't do anything for 10 days, just ignores it on his desk, and Congress is in session, automatically becomes a law. If Congress isn't in session, though, and he ignores it for 10 days, this is called a pocket veto, and it's automatically the bill dies. Okay, that's it for this time.